The airport was bustling with the familiar hum of travelers, announcements crackling over the intercom, the rhythmic click of suitcases rolling across the floor, and the muffled conversations of people eager to reach their destinations. Among the crowd, Sergeant Leah Matthews moved quietly, her presence steady but unassuming. Her olive green uniform bore the marks of long service, fabric slightly faded, seams softened by time and hardship. The duffel bag slung over her shoulder felt heavier than it should have, though it wasn't the weight of its contents that burdened her. Leah had just returned from her latest deployment, the culmination of months spent in a distant, arid landscape that had etched itself into her memory. The fatigue of service clung to her, a quiet companion she had learned to carry. But today, her thoughts weren't in the past. They were on the journey ahead, a flight that would finally bring her home. As she approached the gate, Leah noticed the way some eyes lingered on her. She had become accustomed to it over the years. The curious, sometimes cautious glances that followed her uniform. For some, it was admiration; for others, it was something less kind. An undercurrent of judgment she couldn't fully escape. She never let it show that she noticed. Instead, she offered polite nods and moved on. The gate agent handed her a boarding pass with a warm smile. "Thank you for your service, Sergeant," she said, her voice sincere. Leah returned the smile. "Thank you," she replied softly, pocketing the ticket. It wasn't until she reached her seat that she realized the airline had upgraded her to first class. She paused for a moment, the unexpected gesture catching her off guard. She wasn't accustomed to luxury, to the plush leather seats and the quiet hum of a cabin set apart from the hustle of the main cabin. She felt out of place but grateful, quietly settling into the window seat marked *3A. As the plane began boarding, Leah watched the other passengers filter in. Businessmen in tailored suits, women clutching designer bags, and an older couple chatting in hushed tones. She could feel their eyes darting toward her, some offering tight-lipped smiles, others quickly averting their gaze. It was a subtle thing, not overt but present a reminder that even in uniform, she didn't entirely fit the image of what some expected in a first-class seat. Leah leaned back, allowing herself a moment to breathe. The seat was far more comfortable than she was used to, and for the first time in what felt like months, she began to relax. She thought about the home she was returning to, the family waiting for her, the familiar comforts she had missed. But her respite was short-lived. "Excuse me," a voice interrupted, sharp and clipped. Leah looked up to see a man standing in the aisle beside her. He was tall, dressed in a crisp navy suit that seemed tailored to perfection. His expression was one of irritation, his brow furrowed as he glanced from her to the seat number above. "I believe you're in the wrong seat," he said, his tone carrying an edge that made it clear he wasn't asking. Leah blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "I don't think so," she replied, keeping her voice calm. She pulled out her boarding pass and held it up. "This is 3A, right?" The man leaned closer, squinting at the ticket as if expecting to find an error. When none presented itself, he straightened, his lips tightening. "There must be some kind of mistake," he said. "This is first class." Leah felt a familiar knot form in her stomach, the same one that surfaced in moments like this. "Yes, it is," she said evenly. "This is my seat." The man's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Leah thought he might argue further. Instead, he muttered, "Unbelievable," under his breath, shaking his head as he turned away. The words weren't meant for her, but she heard them clearly. She felt the weight of the moment settle over her. It wasn't just the man's reaction. It was the quiet ripple it sent through the cabin. She could feel the unspoken judgments, the subtle shifts in posture, the careful avoidance of eye contact. It wasn't new, but it still stung. Leah focused her gaze out the window, the clouds outside offering a momentary distraction. She had faced far worse than this, she reminded herself. But even so, the small indignities lingered, carving out spaces in her mind that were difficult to ignore. As the plane filled and the cabin doors closed, Leah closed her eyes, hoping to let the tension fade. But even as the engines roared to life, carrying the plane into the sky, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She opened her eyes briefly, catching the man's gaze from a few rows back. He looked away quickly, but the disdain in his expression was unmistakable. Leah leaned her head against the window, exhaling slowly. She was used to navigating challenges, to facing obstacles with quiet resilience. But in moments like this, the weight of being both a soldier and a black woman felt heavier than ever. As the plane leveled out, Leah made a quiet decision. She wouldn't let this man's prejudice define her journey home. She had fought too hard, endured too much, to let a stranger's assumptions take away her peace. What she would do about it, she wasn't yet sure, but she knew she wouldn't carry the bitterness with her. The clouds stretched endlessly outside the window, a reminder of the distance she had traveled and the ground still left to cover. The plane hummed softly, its steady rhythm blending with the occasional shuffle of papers and muted conversations. Sergeant Leah Matthews shifted slightly in her seat, trying to find comfort in a space that still felt foreign. The man from earlier. His reaction, his tone, his disbelief lingered in her mind. It wasn't the first time she had faced such moments. But familiarity didn't dull the sting. Leah glanced toward the back of the cabin. The man was seated just a few rows behind her, his posture stiff, his eyes fixed on a tablet in his lap. Occasionally, his gaze would flicker in her direction, quickly retreating whenever she noticed. It wasn't overt hostility, but it was enough to remind her of the quiet tension that still hung in the air. She exhaled softly, returning her attention to the view outside the window. The clouds rolled by in endless waves, their serenity at odds with the discomfort she felt. Moments like these reminded her that prejudice didn't always announce itself with raised voices or explicit words. Sometimes, it was a glance, a tone, an unspoken assumption that carried just as much weight. Behind her, David Whitaker. He hadn't introduced himself yet, but Leah would later learn his name struggled to focus on the screen in front of him. The incident at the start of the flight replayed in his mind, each detail sharper than it had felt in the moment. He couldn't pinpoint exactly why he had reacted the way he did. It wasn't the uniform. He respected the military. He told himself, his brother had served. After all, maybe it was the surprise, the incongruity of seeing someone like her in a space that felt reserved for a certain type of traveler. He frowned at the thought, discomfort creeping in. Was that how he had seen her? Someone who didn't belong. He shifted in his seat, glancing up again, this time careful not to let his gaze linger. She sat there quietly, composed, her face turned toward the window. He felt a pang of guilt, though he wasn't ready to name it as such. Instead, he returned to his tablet, hoping the distraction would drown out his thoughts. Leah reached into her bag, pulling out a small notepad and pen. Writing had always been her way of sorting through thoughts too tangled to express aloud. She didn't write much, just a few sentences, the words coming slowly but deliberately. I've seen the cost of the freedom we take for granted. I carry the names and faces of those who didn't make it home. And yet, even in service, we are seen as less than, as other. It doesn't matter how many miles we've walked, how many battles we've fought. The assumptions remain. She paused, staring at the words on the page. They weren't meant for anyone else. Not yet. They were for her, a reminder to stay grounded, to carry herself with the quiet dignity that had always been her armor. She folded the page neatly and slipped it back into her bag, deciding to hold on to the thought for now. The flight attendant moved gracefully through the aisle, offering drinks and snacks. When she reached Leah's row, her smile was warm, genuine. Anything for you, Sergeant Matthews? She asked, her tone carrying a quiet respect that Leah appreciated. Just water, thank you, Leah replied, returning the smile. The attendant nodded and moved on, her professionalism never faltering, but Leah caught the subtle glance she gave toward the back of the cabin, where David sat. It wasn't judgmental, but it was knowing, as if she too had sensed the tension and was navigating it with careful neutrality. David noticed the flight attendant's glance and felt his face flush. He didn't know if it was shame or frustration, but it settled heavily in his chest. He hadn't meant for the exchange earlier to escalate. It wasn't even supposed to be an exchange. He had simply acted, spoken without thinking, but now, He couldn't shake the feeling that he had been wrong. His thoughts drifted to his brother, Eric, who had served in Afghanistan. Eric had been the kind of man who treated everyone with respect, no matter their background. David had always admired that about him. He wondered, uncomfortably, what Eric would have thought of his actions today. As the plane cruised at 30,000 feet, Leah leaned back, allowing herself a rare moment of stillness. The hum of the engines provided a soothing backdrop, a constant reminder that she was moving forward. Quite literally, her thoughts drifted to her family waiting at home. The warm embrace of her mother, the laughter of her younger brother, the smell of her favorite meal waiting in the kitchen. These were the moments that sustained her, that reminded her why she continued to serve despite the challenges. Behind her, David remained restless. He tapped his fingers against the armrest, his thoughts swirling in directions he couldn't control. The note he hadn't yet received was coming. He didn't know it, but it would soon shift something within him, a nudge, small but significant, toward understanding. For now, they both sat in silence. Two strangers bound by an unspoken tension. The distance between them as much about perception as it was about physical space. Above the clouds, the world seemed infinite, its possibilities endless. Neither of them knew it yet, but they were on the verge of a connection that would remind them both of their shared humanity. The plane glided steadily through the sky, its engines a low, comforting hum. The atmosphere inside the cabin was quiet, punctuated only by the soft rustling of newspapers and the occasional chime of a call button. Sergeant Leah Matthews sat in her seat, her gaze fixed on the endless expanse of clouds outside the window. From this height, the world below felt distant, its weight momentarily lightened, yet the subtle tension from earlier lingered, a quiet undercurrent that refused to dissipate. Leah shifted slightly, adjusting the strap of her duffel bag beneath her seat. Her mind wandered back to the man a few rows behind her. The disbelief in his eyes, the sharp edge in his voice as he questioned her presence in first class. She had encountered prejudice before, in forms both subtle and overt. This wasn't new, but it still hurt. It always did. It wasn't just his words, though they had been cutting. It was what they represented, an assumption about who she was and where she belonged. Formed in an instant and without merit. Leah exhaled softly, willing the frustration to dissolve. She wasn't going to let this ruin her journey home. David Whittaker sat stiffly in his seat. The tray table in front of him cluttered with a half-empty cup of coffee and a tablet he wasn't reading. His mind kept drifting back to the exchange that had left him feeling uneasy. He had spoken without thinking, driven by an instinct he now struggled to justify. The woman in the uniform, Leah, the flight attendant had called her. Had done nothing wrong. She had simply been there, occupying a space he hadn't expected her to. He hated the way his reaction lingered in his chest, a knot of discomfort that wouldn't loosen. He told himself it wasn't about her specifically. It was about the surprise, the unexpectedness of it all. But deep down, he knew there was more to it. He didn't like what that said about him. David glanced toward her seat, careful to avoid being obvious. She sat still, her posture calm but resolute. She didn't seem angry. At least, not outwardly, but there was something in the way she held herself, a quiet strength that made him feel small. He thought of his brother Eric, who had served in the military with pride and dignity. Eric would have been furious with him for what he'd said. Leah pulled her notepad from her bag again, flipping to the page where she had jotted a few sentences earlier. She stared at the words, debating whether to write more. There was something cathartic about putting her thoughts on paper, about giving form to the feelings she often kept buried. After a moment, she began to write again. It's not the words that stay with you, it's the look. The assumption that you don't belong, that you haven't earned your place. I've faced it before, and I'll face it again. But today, I won't carry it with me. Today, I'll let it go. She paused, tapping the pen against the page. The note was for herself. But as she read it over, she wondered if it could also be for him. Could words bridge the gap between them? Could they change the course of a moment that had started with judgment and hurt? Leah folded the paper neatly, tucking it into her pocket for now. She wasn't sure if she would share it, But the thought gave her a sense of quiet resolve. Dash dash dash. The flight attendant passed through the aisle again, collecting empty cups and discarded wrappers. Leah stopped her with a gentle wave. "Excuse me," Leah said softly. "Would you mind giving this to the gentleman in 5A?" She held out the folded note. The attendant hesitated briefly, her eyes flickering with recognition. She had witnessed the earlier exchange and seemed to understand the significance of the gesture. With a small smile, she nodded and took the note. Leah watched as the attendant approached David's seat, handing him the folded paper. He looked surprised, his brow furrowing as he accepted it. She turned back toward her window, unwilling to watch his reaction. Dash dash dash. David unfolded the note carefully, the crisp lines of the paper revealing words written in neat, deliberate handwriting. He read it once, then again, his expression softening as the meaning sank in. The note wasn't confrontational. It wasn't angry or accusatory. Instead, it was honest, reflective, a glimpse into the mind of someone who had faced far more than he could imagine. "I'm proud to serve my country and to protect the freedoms we all enjoy." The note read. "But sometimes, those freedoms come with a cost. I've seen it, I've felt it, and I carry it with me every day. All I ask is that we see each other for who we truly are, not for our differences, but for our shared humanity." David swallowed hard, the weight of the words settling over him. He felt a pang of guilt, sharper now than before. He had misjudged her, not just in the moment, but in a way that cut deeper. She hadn't responded with anger or defensiveness. Instead, she had chosen grace, offering him a chance to reflect. He folded the note carefully, tucking it into his pocket as if it were something fragile and precious. He didn't know what to say or how to say it, but he knew he had to find the right words. Dash dash dash. The rest of the flight passed in silence, the cabin returning to its muted rhythm. Leah remained by the window, lost in her thoughts. She didn't know if her note had reached him in the way she hoped, but she felt a sense of peace knowing she had tried. Behind her, David sat quietly, the note burning in his pocket like a small, persistent flame. It was a reminder, not just of his mistake, but of the opportunity to make it right. As the plane began its descent, the tension between them remained unspoken but changed. Above the clouds, they were still strangers, but beneath the surface, something had shifted. A bridge had begun to form. The plane began its slow descent, the gentle hum of the engines signaling the approach of the journey's end. The cabin lights softened, casting a warm glow over the rows of passengers. Leah Matthews sat quietly, her hands resting on her lap as she gazed out the window. Below, the city's lights shimmered like scattered stars, a reflection of the world she was returning to. The note she had written was no longer in her possession, and with it, the weight of expectation had eased. She didn't know how the man behind her, David Whitaker, had received it. But she had made her choice. She had spoken her truth, even if only in ink. Now, she allowed herself to focus on the thought of home, letting the familiar anticipation of reunion soften the edges of the day. Behind her, David sat stiffly in his seat, the folded note still in his hand. He had read it more times than he cared to admit, each word carving a deeper path through his thoughts. Her words weren't just a reflection of her experiences, they were a mirror, forcing him to confront his own assumptions. The discomfort he felt wasn't anger or defensiveness. It was recognition. David glanced toward the front of the cabin, his eyes lingering on Leah's silhouette. She hadn't looked back, and hadn't sought his reaction. Her posture was calm, her focus entirely elsewhere. The note hadn't been written for attention or apology, it was a gesture of quiet dignity, one that he felt compelled to acknowledge. Dash dash dash. As the plane touched down and the landing gear rumbled against the runway, the passengers stirred, gathering their belongings and preparing to disembark. Leah reached for her bag, her movements deliberate and unhurried. The anticipation of being home filled her with a quiet energy, a sense of relief that this chapter of her journey was nearly over. David hesitated as the rows ahead began to empty. His heart pounded with a nervous rhythm he didn't fully understand. He wanted to say something, to acknowledge the note and the truth it carried, but words felt clumsy and insufficient. Still, he knew he couldn't let the moment pass without trying. As Leah stood to retrieve her duffel bag, David rose from his seat and stepped into the aisle. The distance between them felt immense, though it was only a few short rows. He approached cautiously, his voice soft as he spoke. "Sergeant Matthews." Leah turned, her expression neutral but attentive. "Yes?" David held up the note. The paper slightly creased from being folded and unfolded. He began, faltering for a moment. He cleared his throat. "I wanted to thank you for this. For your words." Leah studied him, her gaze steady but not unkind. "You're welcome," she said simply. David hesitated, his hands tightening around the note. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice quieter now. "For earlier, I made assumptions about you that were wrong. And I'm sorry." Leah tilted her head slightly, her expression softening. "It takes courage to admit when we're wrong," she replied. "Thank you." He nodded, his face tinged with a mix of relief and lingering regret. "My name's David," he added, as if offering his name was part of the apology. Leah extended her hand, her grip firm. "Leah." The handshake was brief but sincere, a quiet acknowledgement of the moment they now shared. As they parted, David lingered for a moment longer, his thoughts still tangled but lighter than before. The passengers exited the plane, stepping into the bustling terminal where the sounds of reunions and farewells filled the air. Leah spotted her family in the crowd, their faces bright with anticipation. Her mother waved enthusiastically, her younger brother holding a small handmade sign that read *Welcome home. Leah. The sight brought a genuine smile to Leah's face, the tension of the flight slipping away as she moved toward them. David walked a few paces behind, watching as Leah embraced her family. He felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. Not jealousy, but a wistful longing. His own family reunions had once been like that, before his brother's death had cast a shadow over them. He tucked the note into his pocket, resolving to share the story with his wife later. It was a small gesture, but it felt important to him. As Leah and her family moved toward the exit, she glanced back briefly, her eyes meeting David's one last time. He gave a small nod, one that she returned without hesitation. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it didn't need to be. In that brief exchange, there was understanding, a quiet acknowledgement of shared humanity that transcended the tension of their earlier encounter. Later that evening, Leah sat on the edge of her bed, the hum of her family's laughter still echoing in the background. She thought about the flight, about David's apology and the way his expression had softened as he spoke. It wasn't a resolution to the larger issues she faced, but it was a reminder that change often began in small, unexpected moments. David, too, found himself reflecting as he sat in his living room, the note still in his pocket. He thought about his brother, about Leah, and about the assumptions that had shaped his actions. He knew he couldn't undo the past, but he could choose to carry the lesson forward. The night settled over both of them, quiet and still. For Leah, it was a reminder of the strength it took to walk with dignity through a world that often questioned her place. For David, it was a first step toward seeing the world and the people in it with clearer eyes. Above them, the same stars stretched across the sky, distant but unwavering, a silent witness to their journey. The morning light filtered softly through the windows of Leah Matthews' childhood home, casting warm, familiar patterns on the walls. She sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. The hum of her family's voices drifted from the living room, blending with the faint sounds of morning news on the television. It was a comforting backdrop, a sharp contrast to the weight of the previous day. Leah's thoughts wandered back to the flight, to the man in the suit, David, and the apology that had followed their tense encounter. It wasn't the first time she had been judged unfairly, and it wouldn't be the last. But there had been something different about this moment. His words, hesitant but sincere, had stayed with her. She sipped her coffee, staring out the window at the quiet street she had grown up on. The world outside felt so far removed from the one she had navigated in her uniform. Yet the challenges, those subtle, persistent barriers, seemed to follow her, no matter where she went. David Whittaker sat in his office that same morning, A cup of cold coffee forgotten on his desk. The note Leah had written sat in front of him. Unfolded, its words now familiar enough to recite from memory. He had read it again before bed the night before. And now, as he stared at it in the morning light, it felt heavier than the paper it was written on. David thought of his brother Eric, whose military portrait still hung in the hallway of his home. Eric had been a man of principle, always quick to defend those who couldn't defend themselves. David felt a pang of guilt as he thought about how Eric might have reacted to his behavior on the plane. Would he have been disappointed? Or worse, ashamed? David sighed and leaned back in his chair. The apology he had offered Leah hadn't erased the sting of his actions. But it was a start. He couldn't undo what had happened. But he could choose what to do next. Leah spent her day reconnecting with her family, finding solace in their warmth and familiarity. Her younger brother, Caleb, had endless stories to share about his school projects and basketball games. Her mother, always the steady anchor in Leah's life, made Leah's favorite dishes and reminded her, with quiet encouragement, of the strength she carried. But even in these moments of joy, Leah couldn't help but reflect. The note she had written to David had been an act of vulnerability, a way to bridge a gap she hadn't created but felt compelled to address. She wondered if it had truly reached him. If it had sparked the kind of reflection that could lead to change. "Penny, for your thoughts?" Her mother's voice broke through her reverie. Leah smiled faintly, setting down her fork. "Just thinking about yesterday," she admitted. "About someone I met on the flight." Her mother tilted her head slightly, concern flickering in her eyes. "Not all good, I take it?" "Not at first," Leah said. "But people surprise you sometimes. Even when they start on the wrong foot." Her mother nodded, a knowing look crossing her face. "Sometimes. That's all it takes, a little room for surprise." David returned home that evening, greeted by the familiar clatter of dishes in the kitchen. His wife, Emily, was preparing dinner, her movements fluid and practiced. She glanced over her shoulder as he entered, offering a warm smile. "You're home late," she said, turning back to stir the pot on the stove. "Busy day?" David hesitated. "Not busy," he said, setting his briefcase down by the door. "Just thoughtful." Emily paused, sensing the weight in his voice. "Something happen?" David joined her at the counter, leaning against it as he considered how to explain. "On the flight yesterday," he began, "I said something. Did something that I'm not proud of." Emily stopped stirring, turning to face him fully. "What happened?" David explained the encounter with Leah, from the assumption he had made to the note she had written. He left nothing out, his voice growing quieter as he spoke. When he finished, Emily studied him for a long moment, her expression softening. "She sounds remarkable," Emily said, "and brave, to write that note." "She is," David admitted. "It wasn't just brave. It was generous. She didn't have to say anything. She could have ignored me completely. But she didn't." Emily reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "It sounds like she gave you a gift. One you're taking to heart." David nodded. "I just keep thinking about Eric," he said, his voice faltering slightly, "about how much he believed in fairness, in treating everyone with respect. I let him down yesterday." Emily squeezed his arm gently. "What matters is what you do now," she said. "Eric would have understood that." That night, Leah sat on the back porch of her family's home, the cool breeze brushing against her skin. The stars above were clear, their light unchanging and constant. She thought about the small moments that had shaped her journey. The connections made, the words exchanged, and the barriers broken. David sat in his own quiet space, the note tucked into his wallet. He resolved to keep it, not as a reminder of his mistake, but as a symbol of his intention to do better. The lessons Leah had imparted in those simple, heartfelt words had ignited something within him. The understanding that even the smallest gestures of humanity could create ripples far beyond their origin. For both Leah and David, the day ended with a sense of quiet reflection. Their encounter on the plane had been fleeting, but its impact lingered. It was a reminder that change often begins not with grand actions, but with the willingness to listen, to learn, and to grow. Above them, The same stars stretched across the night sky. A shared canvas for two people on parallel journeys toward understanding. The days following the flight unfolded quietly for both Leah Matthews and David Whittaker. Yet the encounter between them lingered in their minds. Unspoken but persistent. For Leah, it was another reminder of the challenges she faced. Not only as a soldier but as a black woman navigating a world shaped by unexamined assumptions. For David, it became an unexpected turning point, a mirror reflecting parts of himself he hadn't yet acknowledged. Leah spent her time at home reacquainting herself with the rhythm of civilian life. Her mother had taken to coaxing her into small joys, visits to the local farmers market, long walks through the park, evenings spent watching old movies with her brother. But even in these moments of peace, her thoughts often returned to the note and the man it was meant for. She wondered what David had done with it, if her words had lingered with him as much as his initial judgment had lingered with her. She didn't carry anger. She rarely did. But there was a quiet yearning for something better. For people like him to see beyond the surface. One evening, as she sat on the back porch beneath a canopy of stars, her brother Caleb joined her, his lanky frame folding into the chair beside her. He held 2 steaming mugs of tea, handing one to her without a word. "You've been quiet lately," he said after a moment. "Quieter than usual." Leah chuckled softly. "That bad, huh?" Caleb shrugged, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Not bad, just noticeable." She glanced at him, seeing the concern in his eyes. Caleb had always been more perceptive than his years suggested. "I've been thinking about the flight home," she admitted. "About someone I met." "Good someone or bad someone?" Caleb asked, his tone light but his gaze serious. Leah hesitated. "A little of both," she said finally. "He made some assumptions about me. Wrong ones. But I think, maybe he's trying to change." Caleb nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes that's the best you can hope for," he said. "A spark. Something to make them think." Leah sipped her tea, letting his words settle over her. A spark. It wasn't much, but it was something. Meanwhile, David found himself increasingly drawn to the words Leah had written. The note had become a small but significant reminder tucked into his wallet, pulled out in quiet moments when the weight of self-reflection felt both necessary and uncomfortable. At work, he began to notice the subtle ways in which biases shaped his interactions, whose opinions he valued, whose stories he dismissed without realizing it. He thought about Leah, about her quiet dignity and the strength it took to respond with kindness instead of anger. One afternoon, as he walked through the halls of his office, he paused before the portrait of his brother Eric. It was a candid photo, taken during one of Eric's deployments. His uniform slightly rumpled but his smile unwavering. David stared at it for a long moment, his chest tightening with the memory of his brother's unwavering belief in fairness and respect. "I'm trying," David murmured aloud, as if speaking to the image. "I'll do better." That weekend, David attended a community event hosted by a local veterans organization. It wasn't something he typically participated in, but Leah's words had stirred something within him, a desire to connect, to understand the experiences of those who had served. The event was small but lively, filled with a mix of veterans, their families, and local supporters. David wandered through the room, listening to conversations, occasionally exchanging a polite nod or a handshake. As he moved between the tables, he spotted an older man seated alone, his uniform jacket adorned with medals that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. David hesitated before approaching. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. The man looked up, his expression warm but reserved. "Not at all," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. David introduced himself, and the man, who said his name was Frank, nodded in recognition. "Eric Whittaker's brother," he said, his tone soft. "I served with him overseas." "Good man." David felt a pang of pride and sorrow. "He was," he said. "I've been thinking about him a lot lately. About the way he treated people, no matter where they came from or what they looked like." Frank smiled faintly. "Eric had a way of seeing people for who they were," he said. "Not everyone has that gift." David nodded, his thoughts turning to Leah. "I met someone recently who reminded me of him," he said. She taught me a lesson I didn't even know I needed. Dash dash dash. Later that evening, David returned home and shared the story of the flight with Emily. She didn't have to write that note, he said, but she did, and it's made me see things differently. Emily reached for his hand, her touch grounding him. Sometimes it takes just one person to make us rethink the way we see the world, she said. Dash dash dash. Across town, Leah sat with her mother in the quiet of the evening, the two of them piecing together a jigsaw puzzle at the kitchen table. You've always had a way of seeing the good in people, her mother said, her tone both proud and contemplative. Not always, Leah replied, but sometimes. I think that's what keeps me going. Her mother smiled, placing another piece into the puzzle. It's a good thing to hold on to. Dash dash dash. The days continued, slow and steady, as both Leah and David carried the memory of their encounter forward. It hadn't solved the larger issues of the world, but it had sparked something within them, a reminder of their shared humanity and the quiet power of connection. Above them, the stars remained constant, a silent witness to the ripples of change taking shape below. The days had turned cooler, and the early hues of autumn painted the streets with muted golds and reds. For Sergeant Leah Matthews, the crisp air felt like a balm, a gentle reminder that seasons, like people, had the capacity to change. She had settled into the rhythm of being home, her days filled with quiet moments shared with her family. Yet, the memory of her flight and the man she had met lingered, a subtle thread woven into her thoughts. Leah didn't dwell on the encounter often, but when she did, it wasn't with resentment, it was with curiosity. She wondered what had become of David Whittaker, if the note she had written had stayed with him in some meaningful way. She wasn't naive enough to expect transformation, but she hoped, quietly, sincerely, that it had planted a seed. Dash dash dash. David, for his part, had been carrying Leah's note in his wallet like a talisman. It wasn't something he mentioned to anyone, not even his wife, Emily, though she noticed the change in him. He seemed quieter these days, more reflective. He had started paying closer attention to the people around him, not just their words, but their silences, their stories, the unspoken things that often went unnoticed. One evening, Emily found him sitting in their den, the note unfolded on his lap. She didn't say anything at first, just sat down beside him and waited. I've been thinking, David said after a moment, his voice soft, about her. About what she said. Emily rested her hand on his arm. And I keep wondering if I've done enough, he replied. If I'm doing enough. Emily nodded, her expression thoughtful. Change takes time, she said, and it starts small. But the fact that you're asking the question? That's a good start. Dash dash dash. A week later, an unexpected opportunity brought Leah and David back into each other's orbit. Leah's local veterans organization was hosting a community appreciation event, inviting supporters and military families to celebrate the contributions of service members. It was a modest affair, folding chairs set up in the town hall. A potluck dinner spread across long tables. But the warmth of the gathering made it feel significant. Leah had agreed to attend at her mother's insistence. Though she wasn't one for public recognition, she preferred to blend into the background, to let others take the spotlight. She arrived early, helping arrange chairs and greeting the familiar faces of fellow veterans and their families. David, too, had been invited, though he hadn't expected it. A friend from his office, a veteran himself, had extended the invitation, urging David to come as a show of support. David had hesitated at first, unsure if he belonged there, but Emily's gentle encouragement had pushed him to accept. Dash dash dash. When David walked into the hall, he spotted Leah almost immediately. She was seated near the front, her posture relaxed but attentive as she listened to the opening remarks. Her uniform, though less formal than before, still bore the quiet dignity that had struck him on the plane. For a moment, he debated whether to approach her. Would she even remember him? Did she want to? But as the evening progressed, their paths crossed naturally. Leah was speaking with a small group of attendees when David approached. His hands tucked nervously into his pockets. She noticed him before he spoke, her expression shifting to one of quiet recognition. David, she said, her tone even but not unkind. It's good to see you. He exhaled, relieved that she remembered. It's good to see you too. He replied. I wasn't sure if you'd want to see me. Leah tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady. Why wouldn't I? David hesitated. Because of how we met. He admitted. Because of the things I said. Leah nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. We all have moments we're not proud of. She said. What matters is what we do after. Her words, simple but profound, hung in the air between them. David felt their weight, the quiet challenge they carried. He nodded, grateful for her grace. I've thought about that note a lot. He said after a moment. I still have it. Leah's eyebrows lifted slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. You do? David pulled his wallet from his pocket, unfolding the well-worn paper. It's been a reminder, he said, of the kind of person I want to be. Leah studied him for a moment, her expression softening. That's a good place to start, she said. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of conversations and speeches. But the brief exchange between Leah and David stayed with them both. For Leah, it was a quiet affirmation that her words had mattered, that even small gestures could create ripples. For David, it was a step forward, a chance to align his actions with the person he aspired to be. As the event wound down, Leah found herself walking toward the exit just as David was doing the same. They exchanged a glance, then a smile. You're doing good work, Leah said, breaking the silence. So are you, David replied. For a moment, they stood there, two people who had started as strangers but had come to understand each other in a way that words alone couldn't explain. Then, with a nod, they parted ways, each carrying the quiet knowledge that the encounter had changed them. However subtly. That night, as Leah sat on her porch beneath the autumn sky, she felt a sense of calm she hadn't expected. The road ahead was still long, and the world was still imperfect. But in moments like these, she was reminded of the quiet power of connection. The way even the smallest interactions could shape the course of a journey. David, too, felt that power as he sat in his den, Leah's note resting on the table beside him. It wasn't just a reminder of his mistakes, it was a guide. A compass pointing him toward a better path. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was heading in the right direction. The season had fully shifted into autumn, the air crisp and the ground strewn with leaves and hues of amber and rust. Sergeant Leah Matthews had returned to her routine, dividing her time between family moments and efforts to reconnect with the civilian world. Yet, the memory of the flight and her encounter with David Whittaker remained with her, like a thread subtly woven into the fabric of her thoughts. David, too, carried the weight of their interaction, though it had transformed into something constructive, a quiet drive to understand more and judge less. The note Leah had written to him had become a guidepost, a reminder of the humanity that lies beneath assumptions and appearances. He found himself reflecting more deeply on his own actions and those of the world around him. One crisp morning, David was invited to speak at a community event focused on fostering understanding and bridging divides. The invitation had come unexpectedly, from an organizer who had heard about his conversation with Leah at the veterans event. At first, he hesitated. What could he say that wouldn't seem hollow or performative? But the thought of Leah's note pushed him forward. Leah, as it happened, had also been invited to the same event. She was hesitant too, though for different reasons. She had grown used to being the listener, the quiet observer, rather than the voice in the room. But this time, she decided to go. Not for recognition, but because she believed in the power of shared stories. The event took place in a modest auditorium, its stage flanked by American flags and a simple banner that read Building Bridges, Conversations on Unity. The crowd was small but engaged, their faces marked with the wisdom of years and the hope for change. Leah sat quietly near the back, unnoticed by most, while David prepared to speak. When David took the stage, his voice carried the weight of introspection. Good morning, he began, scanning the room. I'm here because I made a mistake. A mistake that I've spent weeks reflecting on. And because of that mistake, I learned something valuable, something I hope to share with you today. He recounted his encounter with Leah on the flight, speaking candidly about the assumptions he had made and the way they had shaped his actions. I judged someone not by who they were, but by what I thought I saw. And I was wrong. But instead of responding with anger, this person chose kindness. She gave me a chance to see her not just as a soldier, or as someone different from me, but as a human being. David paused, holding up Leah's note, now carefully laminated to preserve it. These words changed me, he said. They reminded me that it's never too late to grow, to change how we see the world and the people in it. From her seat, Leah watched in quiet surprise. She hadn't expected to hear her words read aloud, and certainly not with such sincerity. Yet, as David spoke, she felt a sense of validation, not for herself, but for the belief that small actions could indeed ripple outward, creating change. When David finished, the applause was warm and genuine. He stepped off the stage, scanning the crowd, and his eyes landed on Leah. Their gazes met, and for a moment, the room seemed to fade around them. David approached her, his expression a mix of gratitude and humility. I didn't know you'd be here, he said, his voice soft but earnest. Leah offered a small smile. I didn't either, but I'm glad I came. David gestured toward the laminated note in his hand. I hope you don't mind. I thought it was important to share. I don't mind, Leah replied, if it made someone think. It was worth it. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment before David extended his hand. Thank you, he said, for your words, for your patience. For everything. Leah shook his hand, her grip steady. Thank you for listening. The event ended with quiet conversations among the attendees, many of whom approached Leah to express their gratitude for her service and her message. She handled each interaction with her characteristic composure, though the warmth in their words touched her deeply. As she prepared to leave, an elderly woman stopped her, her face lined with kindness. Your words reached him, the woman said, and through him, they've reached all of us. Leah nodded, the weight of those words settling gently over her. I'm glad, she said, that's all I could hope for. That evening, Leah returned home, the quiet of her porch offering solace after the day's unexpected turn. She looked up at the stars, their light steady and unchanging, and thought about the paths that had crossed and the lessons shared. The world was far from perfect, but moments like these reminded her that change didn't have to be loud to be meaningful. David, sitting in his own home, reflected on the same event. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose tied not to his achievements, but to his willingness to grow. He thought of his brother Eric, whose memory had driven him to this moment, and of Leah, whose kindness had shown him the way forward. The season would change again, as it always did, but the echoes of their encounter would remain. For Leah and David, it wasn't about resolution. It was about progress, about the small steps toward understanding that made the journey worthwhile. And as the night deepened, they each carried the quiet hope that their story, shared now with others, might inspire new beginnings in ways they would never see.